All right, so are you ready to tackle a hot button issue?
Always up for a challenge.
Okay, good. Because today we're diving deep into this concept of a national divorce
Yes.
in the U.S.
Splitting the country along those red and blue lines.
Exactly. And we're not here to pick sides or anything.
Right, just to really break it down and see what's what.
Exactly. And we're going to be using a really thought-provoking video essay as our guide for this deep dive.
Oh, cool. Whose is it?
It's by political commentator Kartik Gada. Have you heard of him?
Yeah, I've seen a few of his videos. He's got some pretty interesting takes.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from tough topics.
And in the sense that he really digs into this national divorce idea.
Like whether it could actually work.
Or if it would just be a recipe for total chaos.
Right. And he brings up some surprising historical shifts in, like the global economy.
Stuff that you might not immediately think about when you hear national divorce.
Exactly. So let's start with the economic side of things.
Okay.
Gada dives into this concept of reserve currency.
Reserve currency.
Yeah, it sounds kind of technical, but it actually affects us all in a huge way.
How so?
Well, think about it like this. When you travel to another country and you exchange your dollars for their currency.
You usually get more of their money for your dollars, right?
Exactly. And that's partly because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency.
So it's like the gold standard, even though we're not on the gold standard anymore.
Yeah, basically, countries all over the world hold on to U.S. dollars like it's gold.
Because they're the most trusted and used for international transactions.
And that gives the U.S. a lot of power economically on the world stage.
I see.
So how does this tie into a national divorce?
Well, Gada says if we split the U.S., we'd probably lose that reserve currency status.
And that would be bad?
Yeah, it could mean like a 20% drop in our standard of living.
Whoa. Seriously, 20%.
That's what he predicts.
How does he come up with that number?
He compares the U.S. to countries like Canada and Australia.
Oh.
They're
Right.
pretty similar to us in terms of productivity.
But their standard of living is lower.
Right, because their currencies aren't the global reserve.
They don't have that same economic power.
Exactly.
So being this big unified economic force really benefits us.
It does.
But some people argue that a red America could still be a big player on the world stage.
Yes.
They could create their own economic power.
Well, Gada brings up China and their BRICS initiative.
BRICS.
Yeah, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Oh, right. It's like their attempt to create a rival to the U.S. dollar.
Exactly.
But is that a serious threat, though?
Gada actually thinks it's not that serious.
Why not?
He focuses on the S in BRICS,
Hmm.
which is for South Africa.
Interesting.
He says including South Africa, which is a relatively small economy, shows that the whole initiative isn't a real challenge to the U.S. dollar.
So he thinks the U.S. still has the upper hand economically.
Yeah.
But what about the idea that a red America could just build its own strong economy?
Well, Gada thinks that a split U.S. would probably end up with a weaker military-industrial complex
Oh, okay.
and a smaller federal government.
And that would hurt the economy.
It would make it harder for them to maintain a strong global standing.
Okay, so the economic arguments against a national divorce are pretty clear.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the political side of things.
Sure.
Isn't the whole point of a national divorce to let each side live by their own values?
That's where Gada's analysis gets really interesting.
Okay.
He takes us way back to the 1984 election where Reagan won like a landslide.
Reagan won big.
He won 49 states. Even California was solidly Republican back then.
Whoa, I can't even picture California as anything but blue these days.
Right. It shows you how much the political landscape has changed over time.
So what we think of as red and blue isn't set in stone.
Exactly.
Gada's point is that those labels are more fluid than we realize.
Yeah, and he says both parties have actually shifted leftward over the decades.
What do you mean?
He says if you listen to what candidates like Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale were saying back then,
Okay.
their ideas would be considered right-wing by today's standards.
That's wild. So this idea of a red country staying true to conservative values.
It might be more complicated than it seems.
Exactly. It's not just about a static red and blue divide.
There are ongoing shifts in political thought, even within those hypothetical nations.
So even if we created a separate red nation, it wouldn't necessarily stay super conservative.
Right, it might just keep drifting leftward over time.
So that raises the question of whether a national divorce would even be a long-term solution.
Yeah, would we just end up with more calls for further splits down the line?
It's like a never-ending cycle of division.
Right.
And speaking of division, how would we even go about splitting the country in the first place?
It's not as simple as drawing a line on a map.
Definitely not.
Gada points out that only 37 out of 50 states have consistently voted for one party in the 21st century.
So the rest are swing states.
Exactly, those unpredictable states that could go either way.
So we're not even dealing with a clear-cut red-blue map to begin with.
Right, and then there's the issue of border security.
Something Republicans often worry about.
Yeah, and Gada uses that as an example.
How?
He questions how a red nation with a potentially larger and more porous border.
Would actually handle immigration.
Yeah, that's a bit of a paradox.
It seems like there are a lot of practical problems with this national divorce idea.
There are.
And Gada doesn't stop there.
He goes on to explore the interdependence between red and blue areas.
Which is something people often forget about.
Right, we tend to focus on the differences.
Yeah, but Gada points out that red-blue areas actually rely on each other in a lot of ways.
Like he talks about how red counties produce most of the food.
And blue counties have the airports, corporations, universities.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected different parts of the country are.
He uses this great analogy about cutting an earthworm in half versus a human.
Oh, yeah, what was that again?
Well, with an earthworm, you might end up with two smaller worms.
Okay.
But with a human, it's a totally different story.
You can't just split a complex organism like that.
And expect both halves to function on their own. Right. So he's saying the U.S. is more like a complex human body.
It's a simple earthworm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a national divorce wouldn't be this clean break.
It'd be more like a messy and harmful separation.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic issues, the shifting political landscape, and the practical challenges of actually dividing the country.
Yeah, it's more complicated than it seems at first glance.
But there's still so much more to explore. Gada brings up some fascinating stuff about the media and other commentators like Bill Maher.
Oh, yeah, I want to hear about that.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll keep diving deeper into Kartik Gada's essay and see what other insights he has to offer.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back and still digging into this national divorce idea with Kartik Gada's essay as our guide. And remember, we talked about those economic roadblocks and how American political identity is always changing.
Right, like it's not as simple as just red versus blue.
Exactly. And Gada brings up some other interesting voices too, like Bill Maher.
Oh, yeah. Maher's always got something to say.
He really does. And he's got this analogy about the conflict in Northern Ireland.
What does Northern Ireland have to do with a national divorce in the U.S.?
Well, Maher says that political identity has become such a huge dividing line here.
Even bigger than religion or race?
That's what he argues, and it's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like we've swapped one set of divisions for another.
And maybe even a worse one.
Exactly. Maher's worried that this level of polarization is pushing us toward this us versus them mentality.
Where we can't even find common ground anymore.
It's like we've forgotten how to disagree without hating each other.
And it's not like Maher's afraid to call out both sides.
He's pretty equal opportunity when it comes to criticism.
Yeah, he talks about the Church of Woke on the left.
And the cult of Trump on the right.
He sees both of those as contributing to this toxic division, so nobody gets a free pass from Maher.
Nope. He's calling out the extremes on both sides.
But even with all that criticism, Maher still seems to be advocating for unity, right?
Well, definitely. He's not saying we should all agree on everything.
But we need to remember that we're all Americans first.
We have to find a way to stay together despite our differences.
I think that's something Gada agrees with, too.
Yeah, he talks about the economic and cultural benefits of being a big, diverse nation.
Like, there's strength in our differences.
Exactly, and he brings up that idea of economies of scale again.
Right, the bigger we are, the more power we have.
He even points out how the U.S. dominates the English language globally.
Which is something we might lose if we split up.
It's kind of crazy to think about how much we take for granted as a unified nation.
Okay, this next point might be a little controversial, but Gada has this idea about the middle 70% of Americans.
Oh, yeah. What's his take on that?
He thinks that most Americans could actually find common ground.
If it weren't for the two-party system.
Exactly. He says the current system amplifies those extreme viewpoints.
And creates a sense of division that doesn't really reflect the majority of Americans.
It makes you wonder if the way we do politics is actually making things worse.
Like we're focusing on the fringes and ignoring the vast middle ground where most people actually are.
It's like the loudest voices are drowning out the moderate ones.
It's hard to have a nuanced conversation when everyone's yelling.
And it's not just political ideology that Gada's looking at.
He also brings in demographics.
Like the growing gender divide in American politics.
Oh, right. He shows that graph of how women's views have shifted leftward.
While men's views have stayed pretty much the same.
It's a pretty dramatic difference.
So how does that gender divide play into this national divorce idea?
Well, Gada asks, if a red nation would basically become a nation dominated by men's values, where women's voices become more marginalized.
It's a valid question, and it adds another layer of complexity to this whole issue.
It's like there's a whole web of interconnected factors.
And Gaeta also throws in some irony when he talks about Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Oh yeah, she's a big proponent of national divorce, right?
Exactly. And he points out that she's really focused on traditional family values.
Despite her own personal history.
With divorce and an affair.
Right, it's not about judging her choices.
But it does make you wonder about her motivation for wanting to divide the country.
Is it really about principle, or is there something else going on?
God is encouraging us to look beyond the surface rhetoric and see the bigger picture.
There's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Okay, so we've covered the economic problems, the political shifts, the practical challenges of dividing the country, the media's role, and even demographic trends.
We've gone deep.
But where does all this leave us? What's the takeaway?
That's the million-dollar question, right? If a national divorce isn't the answer, then what is? How do we fix this division in our country?
Gaeta doesn't have all the answers, but he lays out the complexity of the problem.
And he urges us to resist those easy answers, like just splitting up.
He reminds us that America's strength comes from its diversity.
And our ability to find unity even when we disagree.
It's a powerful message, especially in these times.
Okay, before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on from Gaeta's essay.
His take on the American dream.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
He really challenges some of our assumptions about what it means to achieve the American dream.
And whether it's even possible for everyone.
Exactly. So what's his perspective?
He starts with that classic narrative, anyone can succeed if they work hard enough.
The land of opportunity.
But then he asks if that's still true in America today.
So is he saying the American dream is dead?
Not necessarily, but he thinks it's become a lot harder to achieve.
Especially for certain groups.
Right, like those from marginalized communities.
He connects this to the growing wealth gap and the decline of social mobility.
Like the odds are stacked against some people.
So he's saying the playing field isn't level anymore.
That's his point. He says things like racial discrimination and economic inequality.
Make it harder for some people to get ahead.
Even if they work incredibly hard.
So how does this relate back to a national divorce?
Gaeta thinks that splitting up the country would actually make those inequalities worse.
Really? Why?
He says a red nation with less government and fewer social safety nets.
Would make it even harder for people to escape poverty.
And achieve the American dream.
So instead of solving the problem, a national divorce could actually make things harder for those who are already struggling.
That's what Gaeta's worried about.
It's a sobering thought.
It makes you ask what kind of nation we want to be.
Do we want unity and opportunity for everyone?
Or do we want division and more inequality?
It's a stark choice.
And one that we have to make as a country.
Those are some heavy questions that Gaeta leaves us with.
Yeah, he's not just analyzing the situation. He's asking us to think about the future.
He sees this national divorce idea as a distraction from the real work we need to do.
To address the challenges facing our country,
We can't just give up and split apart.
we have to find solutions that promote unity, equality, and opportunity for everyone.
And that's a good place to pause for now, but don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back to finish up our deep dive into Kartik Gaeta's essay and leave you with some final thoughts. Okay, we're back, and it's time to wrap things up with this national divorce deep dive.
Yeah, after going through all that with Gaeta's essay.
It's clear he really wants us to think critically about this whole idea.
Oh yeah, he definitely doesn't sugarcoat anything.
He lays out the problems facing our country.
But he also pushes back against that easy answer of just splitting up.
He reminds us that disagreement and different viewpoints are part of what makes America unique.
It's figuring out how to handle those differences without destroying ourselves.
Like disagreement is okay, but division is dangerous.
Yeah, finding that balance is tough.
And Gaeta doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide to fix everything.
But he does ask some really important questions.
Like if national divorce is off the table, then what are our options?
How do we move forward as a country when it feels like we're so divided?
It's easy to get caught up in the anger and polarization. But Gaeta wants us to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
What kind of future do we want? For ourselves? For our kids?
The choices we make now will have consequences down the road.
It's a powerful message.
He's not just talking about the problem. He's challenging us to be part of the solution.
So we've done our best to summarize Gaeta's essay.
But you really need to see the whole thing to appreciate all the details.
His video essay is called No Divide, and it's a must-watch.
You'll find even more insights and arguments there.
Gada says the first step to solving a problem is understanding it.
So if you're curious about this whole national divorce idea,
Definitely check out his essay.
it might change the way you think about American politics.
And who knows, maybe it'll even spark some conversations.
That's what we need more of, open and honest dialogue.
We don't have to agree on everything.
But we can at least try to understand each other.
After all, we're all Americans in this together.
We all have a stake in the future of this country.
That's a perfect way to end this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll be back soon with another challenging topic.
Until then, keep those brains working and those conversations going.